Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Angela.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to prove the damages suffered emotionally and financially. Let's start with emotionally. Put yourself in the shoes of the Foleys. Your loved one has been in a coma since the crash. You don't know. There is no timetable for when he will be active again. It's sad. It's a tragedy. The Foleys, they are going through a lot right now. They're very emotional because they probably won't be able to talk to their son ever again. Who knows? He might die in that coma, or he might come back. No one knows. Now let's look at the emotional damages. Danny was thrown from the car. His spine was broken. He suffered multiple head injuries. He's been in a coma since the crash. Simply, Paul suffered a concussion and multiple head injuries and bruises. A concussion, and he fully recovered. Paul fully recovered, and Danny's still in a coma. Does it seem fair? No. Now Danny lives in a nursing home. He's been there since the crash. The parents are bankrupt and are in need of financial assistance. Based on further research, a person who has been in a coma for 6 months, ladies and gentlemen, their medical bill is $6 million. Just for 6 months. 6 months. He has been in a coma, Danny has been in a coma since the crash. No one knows when he's going to be back to his full potential. We seek a substantial amount of 1.5 million every year. Substantial. That's nothing compared to the amount of pain and suffering that the Foleys are going through. The Foleys trusted the Welbys to take care of the child. Sadly, the kid is in a coma. We should have sympathy and empathy for Danny.
It's okay, Angela. What else do you need to say?
Whatever you remember next, and then you can come back to it. We don't know the order.
Thank you.
Mm.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. This case has been rather unfortunate, considering how the Foley's son is now hospitalized and in a coma. This is all due to the Welby's failure to fulfill their responsibility of the safety of minors in their home. They gave alcohol to Paul and Danny knowing that they are minors. They were being negligent, and this caused the damages that were presented today. The Welbys could have done multiple things to prevent this. So, as previously mentioned, the Welbys gave Paul and Danny alcohol. They had bought 4 bottles of champagne and shared with the minors and did not monitor the amount of alcohol that was administered to them. They didn't give any to his younger sister, Darlene, because she was too young. However, why weren't Paul and Danny too young? They are only 3 or 4 years older than Paul's sister, Darlene. Paul and Danny had multiple glasses of champagne as Mr. Welby encouraged them to drink. It is irresponsible for an adult, but for not an adult, but as a parent to encourage underage drinking. If anything, the Welbys should have bought only one bottle of champagne and not given any to Paul or Danny. They could have also monitored the alcohol, knowing how much was consumed, and giving Paul and Danny a limit. This was not the case. Therefore, the Welbys failed to meet responsibility. So what do we have exactly? Two intoxicated teens who also had plans to go out that night. Paul and Danny had plans to go to a party that night. And days before, Ed and Jean were made aware of these plans. They had given Paul permission to use the car for that night days before the incident. They gave Paul and Danny alcohol, completely disregarding the fact that they had other plans and were going to drive. They left the car keys to go out, not even thinking about Paul and Danny. Paul, thinking that his motor skills were not affected, took the keys to drive. This led to the accident that hospitalized Danny Foley. The Welbys could have prevented this from happening. The fact that they failed to prevent it and provided the teenagers with the alcohol shows how they are responsible for the damages that were caused. Ed and Jean Welby could have done many things to prevent this. First, they should not have provided the two teenagers with alcohol. Since they had champagne, they were able to get intoxicated. In fact, Ed allowed the two to drink. As mentioned before, they should have monitored how much alcohol was consumed and set a limit on how many glasses that Danny and Paul could have had. If there would have been a limit, and if the consumption of champagne was carefully monitored, Paul and Danny would have not been able to drink as much champagne as they consumed that night. Next, they should have remembered that Danny and Paul had plans to go use the car that night, and reminded him not to use the car since they had been drinking. If Paul is really as good as a person as said he is, if Paul is really as good as a person as seen, he would obey his parents' wishes and not use the car at all. This would have prevented the accident because no one would be driving. An alternative to this that they could have also done was to take the car keys to ensure that no one would be able to drive that night at all. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if this were you in this predicament. If your son or daughter was put into a coma directly due to the negligence of others, other adults at that. Imagine yourself having to pay for such outrageous medical bills that will surely leave you in a financial crisis. And for what? The chances of Danny's survival are slim right now. Imagine your son or daughter not even fully recovering, then seeing the people who caused it, their child fully recovered. The Welbys will never understand the pain and suffering they have caused. If Paul and Danny had not been given alcohol in the first place, the accident would have not occurred. And Danny could have been living his normal, happy life. If you think for once that the Welbys are not responsible for the damages caused, implore you to reevaluate the facts. If Paul had not been allowed to drive, let alone have the car keys in his possession after having champagne, the accident would have not occurred. The Welbys provided the alcohol, left the keys, and did not set any limitation on the amount of alcohol that they could drink. These are all factors that contributed to the accident, and on these grounds, Ed and Jean Welby are responsible for the accident that hospitalized Danny Foley. For this reason, the Welbys should pay the financial compensation requested by the Foleys.
Good afternoon, Your Honor, and ladies and gentlemen of the jury. As we all know, alcohol is the greatest and most used drug today. It changes stuff such as behavior, and it can change your judgment. My affidavit, Mr. Harris, a member of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, talked to me about the BAC, also known as the blood alcohol concentration level. Paul's concentration level was about 0.14. Ladies and gentlemen, that is 0.6 more than the limit that you're supposed to have while you drive. He also talked about in his deposition about the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, which is that you're supposed to be 21 years old to actually drive and be drinking. Mr. Harris also talked about how this law should have stopped Mr. Ed Welby from giving alcohol to the minors. But what the problem is here, ladies and gentlemen, is that Mr. Welby didn't know. It's what he says. Ladies and gentlemen, should we actually believe him? Ladies and gentlemen, he left 2 bottles of champagne, all unattended, and Mr. Paul Welby and Mr. Danny Foley went inside and took bottles of champagne. They then took the car and went on a drive to a party. What happened next was unfortunate. They got into a car accident. But why? Because of Mr. Welby's 0.14 concentration level, which ultimately affected his driving. The blood alcohol concentration level is supposed to be 0.8, not 0.14, ladies and gentlemen. This ultimately affected them and led to Mr. Danny Foley being in a coma. We don't know if Mr. Danny will wake up tomorrow, next month, next year. As far as we know, he can die tomorrow. It would be unfortunate, but it is true. So, what we are asking for, we don't think it's too much. Why? Because we don't know if Mr. Dan Foley can wake up tomorrow. So what we're asking of our $1.5 million every year until Danny recovers or eventually passes away is nothing for the family. Mr. Harris also talked about how Mr. Welby's negligence ultimately led to this. He said that while Mr. Ed Welby is negligible because of his contribution to this, because of the champagne left unattended. This led to the car crash, but ultimately led to Danny Foley being in a coma. Thank you.